Today, over 2 billion people speak English as a first or second language, making it one of the widest spoken languages on the planet. How did it become the language of the modern world? Formed on an island off the west coast of France as a mix of German and Roman, it gradually became a powerhouse in modern communication, shared with the world by the British Empire. And at its height, the empire was the largest to have ever existed, occupying around a quarter of the world's landmass. Britain subjugated nearly 24% of the global population, responsible for some of the greatest contributions to modern-day art, engineering, and medicine. Britain gave us Shakespeare, the steam engine, and even television. It also had one of the biggest navies in Europe, and with its naval colony, the empire had managed to spread its reach all over the world, from India to Canada, taking the English language wherever it went. But was there also a darker side to the British Empire? Britain helped map our world as we see it. The borders that define most countries today are remnants of European colonialism. For example, the Berlin Conference of 1884, which saw Africa dissected by European empires, still defines many borders in Africa today. Europeans had managed to conquer most of the world by occupying and dividing land, regardless of cultural significance. And Britain was often at the head of the table. For example, the partition of India. In 1947, after 300 years of British occupation, India finally won independence. But before Britain left, they drove a sword through the corpse of the Asian host. Britain tasked itself with dividing the land to separate Muslims and Hindus, drawing a line down the centre of Punjab, an invaluable ally in both world wars. Britain had severed India in two. This caused the largest displacement in history, uprooting 17 million people, roughly the population of Ecuador. Over 1 million people had lost their lives as a consequence. And it's often argued that it was necessary to divide along religious lines, which may be true, but it was Britain themselves who had manufactured religious tension by splitting electorates into Muslims and Hindus. Some say it was simply an oversight, but history paints a more sinister picture. During Britain's expansion, over 180 countries were invaded. Britain fought hard with advanced weaponry, dominating the seas with their naval presence. They ruled with an iron fist, which explains the treatment of the Mau Mau Rebellion. In 1952, when the Kenya Land and Freedom Army organised to take back their rights from British occupation, the Empire retaliated with brutality. Hundreds of thousands of people were forced into concentration camps, tortured, abused, and murdered. A survivor, Naomi Kimweli, reports she was raped using glass bottles, and her husband was castrated with rusty pliers. In 2006, 54 years after the revolt, a case in the High Court was opened against the British government. The ruling judge ordered the release of all files relating to British rule in Kenya, and from that, thousands of records of systemic abuse had surfaced. Foreign Secretary William Hague announced that Britain will pay over $30 million in compensation, and the case was settled. Britain had struck terror in the hearts of Kenyans, and a message was sent to all who stood against them. This can be seen all over the globe. In 1919, a protest had gathered in Punjab. Thousands had collected in the walled gardens to celebrate Vaisakhi, a holy day in the Sikh calendar. People were sharing food, singing hymns, and reciting poetry. But British commanders saw this as a violation of their imposed curfew. British official Reginald Dyer gathered his troops and stormed the gardens, blocking all exits. He ordered his men to open fire on the collected masses, firing for 10 full minutes. A peaceful protest had turned into a bloodbath. Thousands were massacred. A nation terrorized. The British Empire always sent a message to the nations they occupied. Do not resist. During a resistance movement in 1871, 65 Sikh men were strapped to the front of cannons, their bodies torn through by the cannonballs. A message: do not resist. Though it wasn't just the force used against resistance movements that makes it one of the most brutal to have ever existed. Under British rule, countless famines had plagued whole nations, from Ireland to Bengal, and most of them were avoidable. During the Great Hunger of Ireland in 1847, the Irish population reduced by a quarter. A disease that killed potatoes had spread across Europe, affecting one of the empire's largest growers. This left millions of people without food. Starvation littered the streets, and death destroyed communities. A famine had struck Ireland. But when Westminster was informed, Charles Trevelyan, the man in charge of aid, said that this was God punishing the Irish, as it was an effective mechanism for reducing surplus population. Children were dying at their feet, but the Empire exported food out of Ireland, quoting that this was free market. They chose to make money from a starving nation. Winston Churchill projected similar sentiments during the famine of Bengal, which took the lives of over 4 million people. He said, when prompted further, he replied, "If it's so bad, why isn't Gandhi dead yet?" Delusions of racial supremacy seem to be a common theme in British colonies. David Hume, a British philosopher, captured empirical consensus by claiming blacks were inferior to whites, saying whites had monopolized culture, a philosophy that was often repeated in the British Empire. President of the Anthropological Society in London, James Hunt, wrote a paper on the Negro's place in nature, saying the Negro is inferior intellectually to the European and can only be humanized and civilized by Europeans. White supremacy was officially considered mainstream science, forged at the core of empire. Even today, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution portrayed Africans and Indians as primitive races, while Anglo-Saxons, the British, sat at the top of the evolutionary scale. It's clear that racism was at the root of the British Empire. But the question now, is Britain still racist?